Chapter 9 of Dark Horse. As she stepped from a cab in front of the Manger Hay Adams at 10:15 the next morning, Kate Weatherspoon felt like $1 million, or the 17,000 more than her trust fund administered by the Republican National Bank of Dallas. This October Saturday morning stood cool, clear, spiced in the scents of autumn, and in Lafayette Square across H Street from the hotel the grass shimmered and the sun burned off from the first frost of the season. Kate, who wore a cinnamon pantsuit with a looping brass chain slung at her hips, felt that it was a good thing to be a woman, healthy, vibrant, and wearing a new outfit, and especially fine to be a politician bent on business. No less pleasant was a snip of a memory, the wide Potomac lapping solemnly under a quarter moon while Eddie Quinn described in a low, nostalgic voice how, as a boy, he used to trap crabs along the Jersey shore with a fish head and a line and a net. The usually quiet hotel lobby teemed with people. Kate heard the clack of typewriters and noted that the paneled dining room had been roped off and converted into a press center. Newspapermen and women, many of whom she knew, promptly surrounded her. "Is it true you're joining the Quinn staff?" "Yes, it is." "Does that mean you think he can win?" Kate smiled. "Not yet. We have to be practical. Quinn is up against tremendous odds. Still, we'll do our best, and we have 17 days left. There are rumors that your husband and his friends who put Quinn over are furious with him about the oil tax issue," said Sybil Jameson of CBS. "Is that true?" "Now, Sybil, you know how to reach Ted. Just pick up the phone and call his office in Dallas." "But how about you?" persisted Miss Jameson. "Do you favor wiping out the oil allowance with this new human depletion thing?" "I think the idea of a human depletion allowance is very interesting. It might stir up a lot of debate, and that's fine. The whole tax system needs revising." "Vince Anderson of the AP, Miss Witherspoon," said the short, intense man with the wing-like ears who sparred with Eddie the day before. "Does your joining the staff mean that Quinn is endorsing your birth control bill?" "It means he's a man with an open mind. I'll certainly try to persuade him, but I honestly haven't done more than mention it to him thus far. Now, you'll have to let me through. I'm 20 minutes late. I'm committed a cardinal sin in campaign life. I overslept." The pack opened a path for her, but Anderson stayed close by her side as she headed for the elevator. "I'd like to speak to you privately," he said in a low voice. "About what?" Kate, paying scant attention, did not break stride. "About a Blue Olds rented from Avis. The DC tag number is 751742. Kate halted and faced the reporter. "And?" she asked with the stressed coolness. The other newsman began edging in, but Kate held up a hand. "Please, I'm talking to Mr. Anderson." "Quinn asked the press to let him have a free night," said Anderson. "I made no commitment. I don't play that way. I parked on the road near the turnoff to Flannery's cabin." Kate now recalled spotting a stationary sedan with the lights off. "I saw a Blue Olds driven by a woman turn in about 9 and leave around 3:30. This morning I checked the plate with the Motor Vehicles Department. It's an Avis car. At Avis, after a little hassle, I found out the car was rented for the weekend to Catherine Witherspoon." "My, you do work long hours, Mr. Anderson." Kate spoke as calmly as she could. "Just what do you want from me?" "I'm a political reporter, Miss Witherspoon, not a gossip columnist. If you talk to Mr. Quinn about politics, I have to ask you about it. If it was a social call, I'll forget it." Kate stared at him, boiling inwardly as she considered. At last she said, "It was a friendly call. I had no political business with Mr. Quinn last night." "Fair enough." Anderson managed an embarrassed smile. "So we'll forget it." "I won't forget it." Kate was raging now. "And I don't doubt that you will, Mr. Anderson. I imagine you think your little peephole trick is worth something of value to you." "Does that crack mean what I think it does?" "Draw your own conclusions." Kate knew it was a mistake to blow her cool, but her temper tugged her along. "Listen, I make $2.90 a week and never took a dime outside my paycheck. I said I'd forget it. I keep my word." "I apologize," said Kate, knowing she did not. "Okay." The quick flush of indignation still colored his cheeks. "It's not often an overtaxed working lug rates an apology from a woman who married an oil depletion allowance." He turned and strode back to the press room. Kate simmered as she rode the elevator to the 4th floor. So now she and Eddie might become the front page scandal? Anderson might not be a gossip columnist, but he had lines to plenty of the breed. Newspapermen belonged to a close-knit fraternity which choice tidbits about politicians raced about like molecules in a cyclotron. And to her surprise, she found she cared less for her own reputation than she did for Eddie's. A Secret Service agent nodded pleasantly to her as she stepped off the elevator, and Jim Flannery greeted her outside the door to the candidate's suite. She was grateful that his "Good morning, Congresswoman" carried no sly reminders that he had helped her into her car beneath a moon-speckled sycamore tree at 3:30 that morning. She felt a twinge of embarrassment when she entered the sitting room and faced the circle of staffers, but Eddie quickly put her at ease. He threw an arm around her in one of those neuter, bear-like body hugs so favored by male politicians when dealing with a colleague. "Congresswoman Kate Witherspoon," he said with a small flourish of triumph. "Meet the S&T Brain Trust. Pete, you know Margot Hicks, T.G. Churchill, my Uncle Frank Janwinski, R. Dan Finelli, and a couple of newcomers this morning. Congressman Joe Cusick from Cleveland, Phil Liccardo, our public relations man. I borrowed him from the Turnpike." Kate knew Joe Cusick slightly. He was a member of the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, a towering Czech serving his third term in the House. A powerful, shaggy, socially awkward man, a former Olympic discus thrower, Cusick was known for his attacks on the baleful dominance of conglomerates. Phil Liccardo, who huddled at a telephone a few feet away from the circle, reminded Kate of a bartender in a smoky night spot. He wore a pink shirt, a wide, flowered tie, and black sideburns that swept south of his earlobes. She noted his agile, restless air and swiveling eyes. "We're about to get into policy, Kate," said Eddie, offering her a chair. "We've already roughed out a part of the schedule. This afternoon I have a session with the ambassadors at the Pan American Union. The auto crowd wants me for a speech at the Detroit Economic Club, and I've accepted for Tuesday at noon. A week from Monday, a Teamsters Regional Convention in L.A. A couple of ghetto walks that Margot will set up, as many TV panel shows as we can pay for. The rest is all motorcading, starting bright and early Monday." Eddie stopped pacing, dropping into an armchair, and took a swallow of coffee from a cup resting on an end table. "I'm sorry, Kate. Help yourself to coffee from that urn over there. Now, what do I say? Our Danny and I agree that we have to hammer away at the big issues. There's no time for detailed blueprints, and that's not my style anyway. Our job is to jolt people into thinking, build up some pressure so that when he becomes president, Penholster will know damn well what a lot of us want. Okay, then, sticking to the domestic stuff right now, let's kick it around. What bugs you the most? If you were czar or king, what would you tackle first? Let it fly, anything that comes to your mind. TG, take notes for me, would you?" There was an uneasy silence while they eyed one another like guests bidden to an unfamiliar parlor game. At last, Hunk cleared his throat. "Them bureaucrats," he said, his knobby Adam's apple pumping industriously. "Maybe I shouldn't say nothing. I never went past sixth grade, but them snotty Social Security people give me a pain. 6 months they've been stalling me over a measly 48.8 in a month. And them form letters, they act like they own the government, and I'm just something that louses up the system." "So, what would you do about it, Hunk?" asked Eddie. "Fire any bastard that ain't polite to people and junk all that red tape. Just on me alone, they used up about $500 in letter writing time." "It's hell trying to fire anybody in this government," said Pete Stackpole. "Civil service rules." "So let's change some of the rules," said Congressman Cusick. Make arrogance toward a taxpayer cause for dismissal." "Hunk's right about red tape. Why not shift to the Canadian system of old age pensions? Anybody who can prove he's a citizen and over 65 walks in and collects his pension. Throw out all that expensive record keeping, quarters worked, all that hustle. And knock off the Social Security Trust Fund. Old age benefits are all paid out of current revenues anyway." "I like that," said Eddie. "TG, make a note for one of Pete's experts to check out the Canadian system." "I got an idea on the red tape, Eddie," added Phil Liccardo from his post by the telephone. "In my hometown of Perth Amboy, people think Washington is further away than Mongolia. How about a presidential ambassador in every precinct? A guy who will listen to anybody's beef against the government and get some action if it's merited. Yeah, agreed Margot Hicks. People don't know where to turn. Government's so complicated. It sure would help if they could talk to the president's man. Provided they get action, said Ardan Finelli. You're talking about presidential ombudsman now, that's good, but the system would have to be workable, not just a PR gimmick. Kate felt herself being swept into the discussion. What if the president himself made it a practice to surprise visits to some precincts, say once a month, and sit in with personal representatives? She thought about how remote a president seemed from most of her constituents and how they brought Washington-born problems to her as though she were an envoy to a foreign power. It would give people the feeling that the top man cares about their concerns, and it would give the president a feel for the people. Our presidents are too insulated. Sounds good, said Eddie. He turned to T.G., whose long blonde hair brushed her notepad. Put a star after Phil's idea as amended by Kate. Eddie leaned forward and slapped his knees. I like this. We're getting into something. Let's keep rolling. Margot, you're next. What bugs you about the government? The people who've been running it, she said sourly. She considered a moment. Oh God, I hardly know where to start. I guess what really turns off black people is some white dude in Washington telling us what's good for black people. We want a black face behind the mouth that gives us all the free advice. What do you want, a black president? Said Hunk. My nephew don't qualify. Hunk's tart comment did not bother Margot. She grinned at him as though they shared a secret, the admission of their mutual prejudice. Yeah, old man, too bad he ain't. A little black soul wouldn't hurt your nephew either. I guess what I'd like is black men and women heading up every program that has to do with black people. How about an all-black advisory council to the president, suggested T.G. Eddie shook his head. I don't like that any more than an all-Italian council or Polish or Puerto Rican. I want it all-American. A fair shake for everybody. He turned to Margot. Let's do some more thinking about that. I know what you mean, but I'm not sure how to go about it. He swung around to Congressman Cusick. Joe? Break up the goddamn conglomerates, said Cusick. They got all the terrific economic power, political too. They operate like independent governments. Kate and I can name you 50 congressmen who are in some big company's pocket. Might as well be on their payroll. Sure, said Finelli. They'll still believe in William K. Vanderbilt's slogan of the 1880s. What was that? Asked Eddie. When a reporter asked Vanderbilt about whether the public shouldn't be consulted about luxury trains, Vanderbilt said, "The public be damned." Right, said Cusick, and shut the damn tax loopholes, Eddie. You make a good start yesterday with that human depletion allowance, but oil isn't the only villain. The rich have 1,000 ways of ducking taxes. It's the working guy, the steel worker, the auto mechanic who pays the freight in this country. We got to get power back to the people, and one way to do it is to crack down through taxes. Joe Cusick's craggy face came alive as he warmed to his subject. Listen, the dollar is king in this country. You're not going to get that fair shake for everybody unless the dollars are sprung out of those tax-free closets. Look how they beat up the tax wrap. Stock option, big expense accounts, real estate depreciation, tax-exempt municipal bonds. The telephone rang and Phil Liccardo answered while Cusick talked on. You got multimillionaires who don't pay more than 2 or 3 cents of their income in taxes, while the poor working slobs pay 25% or better on his wages. When you figure all the taxes, sales, income, real estate, guys like you and me, Eddie, are patsies for the big boys. It's time we wised up. Hey, broke in Phil Liccardo, I have some news that ties in with that, with what Joe's talking about. Want to hear it? Shoot, said Eddie. They're being flooded with messages at headquarters, reactions to Eddie's press conference. So far, the count is 6,000 telegrams, about 1,000 long-distance calls, and a couple hundred special delivery letters. It's running 7-1 in favor of the human depletion allowance, and a lot of the affirmatives say that Quinn ought to go after those fancy expense accounts and other tax-dodging schemes. Eddie looked pleased. Well, what do you know? I guess someone out there was listening after all. And millions more will, said Cusick, if you go after the whole range of loopholes. And why not? The tax platform pledges a tax review. Well, let's have an honest-to-God one. I tell you, Eddie, it's a damn scandal. Only a very few working people realize what murder the rich are getting away with. It's up to you to preach the message. Lay it on so they can understand. Maybe, said Finelli, we ought to consider an income tax program with no deductions at all. None. Deductions only mean a few bucks to the little guy anyway. Besides, Eddie's offering him a 30% reduction right off. Make the big guys pay the rates they're supposed to. Let's say a big operator takes in $1 million. After his 30% human depletion allowance and paying the top rate, he'd still have about $650,000 left for pocket money. That's bad? Now wait a minute, cautioned Pete Stackpole. What you're talking about is a real tax revolution. You're also flirting with political suicide. If Eddie advocates a progressive income tax with no deductions, he won't get a single vote from those making over $20,000 a year. And if he gets the rest, said Kuzik, he's elected in a landslide. Man, times have really changed, haven't they? But it doesn't work that way, said Pete. Big propaganda guns would open up on Eddie. The media would murder him. Every wheel in the country would turn against him. Okay, Eddie's only a long shot, but we do have to think of the rest of the ticket. At least I intend to. Stackpole glared belligerently around the circle as if he were the lone defender of the faith amid a ragged band of heretics. I'm just as much a party man as you are, Pete, Kuzik shot back, but I want to serve the average guy for a change, not just the Shaker Heights, Grosse Pointe, and Orange County set. Maybe I ought to make my position clear. I called Eddie yesterday and told him he sounded like Eric Hoffer, and thank God for it. He asked me to join the staff. I said I would under one condition, that he was absolutely straight about putting ordinary people in power and not just indulging in windbag talk. He said he meant it all, and I take Eddie at his word. Not in my lifetime has either party nominated a man who reflects the big majority of workers in this country. Until Eddie, our next step is to come up with a program that gets that message across, and taxes is one of the best ways to do it. Right on, exclaimed T.G. Her blue eyes shone with the fervor of a crusader for the proletariat, whose longings she had divined through one summer of washing dishes at a rustic inn on Cape Cod. Kuzik stared at her, blinking solemnly. Taxes are one hell of a complicated subject, gloomed Stackpole. He spoke as though the whole burden of the federal revenue structure rested on his narrow shoulders. But they don't have to be, said Eddie cheerily. That's our job, to simplify. Okay, we're still thinking out loud. Let's move on. Kate? Kate felt somewhat unnerved. She had pictured Eddie's counselors dipping gingerly into the cauldron of social and economic issues, plucking out an attractive, salable item here and there, but she was not prepared for Joe Kuzik's savage frontal assault on people of means, her kind. She could see her proud aunts and affluent cousins being hung by their heels while bonds and currency fluttered from their pockets. She envisioned her own trust fund, which she considered quite modest by Texas standards, evaporating into a puddle of coins under Kuzik's glare, as hot and relentless as the noonday sun over the Rio Grande. She sensed that everyone in the room, with the exception of Pete Stackpole, cheered on Joe Kuzik, and she wondered whether she belonged here at all. Well, I guess everyone here knows my cause, she said hesitantly. I'm here to talk to the candidate into endorsing a real federal program on birth control clinics. The birth rate has dropped recently, but it may only be temporary, and even so, we're growing like mad. A century from now, unless something is done, people will be living jammed elbow to elbow, and if we don't have room to live and breathe, human beings need space. We'll become as vicious as rats. These other big problems you talk about are nothing compared to overpopulation. We'll wind up with a country paved with ocean-to-ocean people. No land to grow food on or resources to exhaust. It will be an ugly, hungry world for all of our grandchildren. Well, now, I don't know, said Margot. Every time I hear a rich white lady like you talking about birth control, I figure what she really means is no more black kids. That's not true, said Kate. Not me, anyway. I resent those pictures of huge white families you see in the newspapers. I thought the Kennedys set a terrible example. All the competitive bragging between Rose and her daughter-in-law Ethel about who popped out the most children. I'm talking numbers, not color. Black families of 7 or 8 kids trouble me, sure, but no more than white suburbanites pullulating all over the landscape. What was that fancy word, Kate? Eddie asked. He grinned. Pull something? Pullulate, said Eddie Liccardo. It means to breed like hell. You'll have Eddie up against the Pope, Kate, but maybe that's okay. My house is Catholic and we use the pill. 2 kids and that's it. Me and the old woman had 7, said Hunk truculently, and I don't want no damn bureaucrats telling people in B Branch how small their families gotta be. That's all we need, a bunch of bed snoopers out of Washington. Wrong, Hunk, said Finelli. You don't need anti-kid cops. The best way to curb population growth is through taxation. Times have changed for Catholics, Hunk. You had 7, but look at the rest of us. Phil says 2. I have 1, a daughter. Eddie stopped at 2. How many do you have, Congressman? 3, said Kuzik. Kate's right, and Eddie doesn't have to run against the Pope. Just lead him. The Vatican is always behind the times. Make love, not kids, said T.G., and proudly jotted down her bon mot in the notepad. Okay, we may make some kind of pitch on birth control, said Eddie. Kate, you get together with R. Danny and Margot and work out something practical. If it makes sense, I'll spring it. All right, you're next, Phil. Liccardo favored repealing the child labor laws and putting teenagers to work. Stackpole passed. He was the nuts and bolts man, he said, and this crew was coming up with enough oddball ideas as it was. Finelli argued for federal chartering of corporations with tight anti-pollution and monopoly controls, and with the proviso that every board of directors include at least 1 member elected by employees and 1 by consumers. T.G. Churchill set off a lengthy wrangle when she argued that garbage collectors should be paid as much as stockbrokers because they perform stinking work that no one else wanted to do. The session slid past the noon hour. Phil Liccardo ordered sandwiches and beverages from room service, and Eddie talked on while he munched a ham and cheese on rye. This time the lettuce was crisp and unblemished. I think we're getting somewhere, he said. You know, I got into this thing without having a chance to think much, but the way those characters at the Astro World tried to maneuver me into running their errands gave me a jolt. I realized I do have strong feelings about this country. Maybe they boil down to this. The average guy in America deserves a lot more of the action. He fights the wars, he builds the highways and bridges, and he pays the taxes, but by God, he doesn't own the country. He doesn't run it, and he doesn't have a glimmer of what the guys at the top get away with. Eddie paused for a swallow of ginger ale. I was kind of surprised yesterday that nobody asked me what books I'd read recently. That's a trap question that slick know-it-all reporters like to spring on guys they consider to be ignorant. Well, I was ready for them. I have read some books in the last year, 3 of them, all recommended by George Dawson, the black guy who lives next to me. He's a big reader. The Rich and the Super Rich by Lundberg. The Great Treasury Raid, a fellow named Stern, I think, wrote it, and America Incorporated by 2 men here in Washington. The books gave me a lot of ammunition for what I'm thinking all along, that the rich movers and shakers, like Joe Kuzik says, always manage to manipulate the Congress for their own benefit and screw the rest of us. We're just consumers who've got to be paid high enough wages so we can buy their products, but we're not allowed the power so we can control our own lives. When those caddy and imperial types in the Astro World down in Houston. Bulletin, cried Phil Liccardo. He had been talking into the phone in a muffled voice. He stood up and brandished a sheet of paper. I was just talking to a desk man at the Washington Post. Gallup is in with the first match of Quinn versus Penholster for Sunday papers. The poll was taken yesterday afternoon and this morning nationwide. He makes it Penholster 55, Quinn 34, and 11 uncertain. About what you'd expect, said Eddie. He downed the last bite of sandwich and brushed his hands, spraying crumbs over the floor. Are you kidding, Eddie? Asked Liccardo. 3 days ago, nobody ever heard of you, and already you've got 1/3 of the vote. It's a start, observed Stackpole, but it doesn't mean much. You got to figure most of that is anti-Penholster vote would go to any stiff running against him. Let's not con ourselves into thinking we have a chance to win, said Eddie. It would cramp our style. Our job is to lay it on the line, make people think. If we get big ideas about winning, we'll start to hedge, play for voting blocks, straddle. The hell with all that. We're going to run a wide-open swinging campaign, and we're not going to suck up to the American Legion, the NAACP, Wall Street Chamber of Commerce, B'nai B'rith, you name it. Amen, said Finelli. Okay, let's get to foreign policy, said Eddie. We'll have to speed it up. I'm due at the Pan American Union at 3. Hunk Jenwinski, no longer shy about his grasp of public matters, led off. If you ask me, we first got to quit butting all over the world. With a few years off, we put in the crops and get patched up in the vets' hospitals. We've been fighting ever since I was in knee pants. Let them foreigners kill themselves off if they want to. We ought to stay home and mind our own business. What we got left of it. Hell, let them Arabs and Israelites go at it first if they're hankering to. Same with the Orientals and the Africans. It's not that simple, said Finelli, but Hunk's on the right track. How about this for openers? No more military aid. From now on, peaceful, economic aid only. Yes, said Kate. It's crazy to peddle arms all over the world. Every time the shooting starts, you find people killing one another with American or Russian guns. I'm against giving anything away, said Hunk. Guns or tractors. Nobody ever gives us stuff. The last thing we got from foreigners was the Statue of Liberty. Them frogs gave us that. One thing that riles me is war profits, said Joe Kuzik. I got a bill in the House, Eddie, that would stop all corporate profits the minute we get into a war. I wish you'd pick it up and back it. There's no justice or morality in people getting fat at home while American boys are being killed abroad. If we ask a young man to offer his life, why shouldn't we ask his old man to sacrifice his wallet? I think you ought to end the draft, Eddie, said T.G. She brushed the long hair from her temples and gazed at him. It's always the young men who do the dying, all the beautiful young ones. Her voice sank. If the old men insist on making war, let them do the dying. Eddie leapt toward her. I'm sorry, T.G., I didn't hear that last part. I said if the old men want wars or something, why shouldn't they do the fighting? Eddie stared at her for a moment. Yes, T.G., why shouldn't they? Pete Stackpole came on strong. Eddie, I'd like to see you pledge that you'd never send American troops to fight outside the country without a declaration by Congress. Everybody knows the president would respond in a few minutes if missiles were launched against us or if the Russian attacks our bases in Europe. But if the president wants to send troops to intervene in places like Vietnam, the First Dominican Republic, or the Dominican Republic, he should present his case to Congress first. Get rid of those big bombs, said Margot. I know the Russians and Chinese are tough, but the American president should keep up the heat until they and we agree to ban all those atom and hydrogen bombs. Right, said Finelli. We ban germ warfare, and we can do it with the nukes. The SALT talks were a beginning, but they just nibbled around the edges. Eddie, I'd like to hear you say, if elected, you'd go to the UN and urge nuclear disarmament by everybody. People are scared stiff of those terrible weapons. I think Hunk is right about the foreign aid, said Phil Liccardo. Man, nobody I know favors giving stuff away, whether arms, goods, or money. Why not limit all our grants overseas to our part in international programs like the World Bank or the UN? The Quinn Strategy and Tactics Council, short on agenda but long on imagination, bobbled and weaved for another half hour in generally peaceful directions. If it showed no lack of resolve in baiting the dragons of pestilence and bloodshed, it nevertheless exhibited an ambivalence toward that quixotic and demon-ridden world west of Hawaii, south of the Rio Grande, and east of the Virgin Islands. Hunk, in particular, was torn between retreat and advance, charity and perniciousness. He would intrude on no foreigner's terrain, but he would hurl the Soviet Navy out of the Mediterranean. He would seal the coffers of foreign aid, but feed starving families in Bangladesh and the high Andes. Had a stranger eavesdropped on the deliberations, he might have detected, in addition to the conflicts of motive, a certain overall restraint and paucity of that self-righteous zeal that once inflamed the American empire in the days of the brothers Dulles. Vietnam, it appeared, was bitter in the memory of everyone. There are a lot of items we haven't covered here, said Stackpole as time ran out. For instance, you'll have to bone up on the monetary hassle, gold, dollars, francs, marks. A candidate has to know the score on international finance. Not one who doesn't expect to get elected, Eddie retorted. He ended the session with a happy fullisade of orders. Pete Stackpole was to button down the schedule and wave a wand for more campaign money. Phil Liccardo should bat out a press release on the volume of telegrams. R. Danny, with the help of Joe Kuzik, would sift today's ideas through a wide-meshed sieve. Eddie and Hunk were to take the rest of the afternoon off and watch the last half of the Ohio State-Purdue game of the week on television. TG was to come along to the Pan American Union and bring her notebook. Eddie, newly a marionette, barked out exuberant commands. For a man who claims that it's all a game, thought Kate, Eddie certainly played it gladly. Kate, let me talk to you a minute. Eddie beckoned her to a corner near a window overlooking 16th Street. He maneuvered so that his back fenced her from view. I only wanted to say that last night was beautiful. How about dinner tonight? You know, candidate talks to advisor. I'd love to, Eddie, but I can't. I promised Susan. Let me call you then so we can talk. About 11? 11's fine. I'll be at the Watergate apartment. I thought you said it was a penthouse. Well, yes. Why was she suddenly reluctant to use a word that hinted of luxury? She loved the place, especially its night view of the Potomac and the glow of the city lights. Eddie, there was bad news downstairs this morning. She quickly described her encounter with Vince Anderson of the Associated Press. Hell, that's not good, Eddie frowned. But if Vince gave his word, I think he'll keep it. I'll talk to him. I don't like it. We're open targets now, though, I guess. I blew my stack when I shouldn't have, she said. He squeezed her hand once, hard and fast, and then they rejoined the others. Eddie and T.G. Churchill rode the few blocks to the Pan American Union in the rear of the elegant Continental Mark IV, while Jim Flannery and a Secret Service driver occupied the front seat. A Secret Service car and a photographer's flatbed truck rode ahead, and a press bus trailed them, in all tidy caravan. The gunning engines of the police motorcade escort delighted Eddie. All for him, Eddie Quinn. You got to me, T.G., when you said the young men in war who do the dying for us old bastards. Yeah, I wish you'd stand up someday and announce you're going to end the draft forever. We live in a world of armies, T.G. Still, you've given me an idea. Eddie lapsed into silence as they passed the ancient Rococo old executive office building, once the citadel of both the old war and state departments, those twins of despair and hope. You look tired, Eddie. I do? He answered mechanically, his mind on the diplomats he was about to face. Yeah, you ought to relax tonight with some good music or something. I really dig music. The words floated past him. His mind was elsewhere. She turned to him. You're a Gemini. Did you know that I'm an Aries? The question hung in the air like smoke. He faced her and saw her eyes upon his. Damn if he understood these young ones. They commanded invitations. I suppose you know about Gemini and Aries. Her sky-blue eyes dwelled on him. No, he didn't, but he could guess. A week ago, he would have taken her hand and asked her to tell him about signs. Now, what? Well, now there was Kate. Not in years had the thought of one woman clouded the living presence of another. A strange development, and one not without regrets. T.G., honey, I'm old enough to be your father. He patted her knee, which was separated from the hem of her skirt by several inches. Age? That applies to babies and old people. Maybe you're right. I hope so, Eddie laughed. I tell you what, a candidate has to be careful where he goes after dark, but tonight I thought I'd take some of the S&T gang bowling. You come along, will you? It makes me feel good to have you around. Same here. Yeah, I'd like that. I only bowled twice in my life. Sorry, I have a fly. She settled back, seemingly content, and a few moments later the motorcade halted at the Pan American Union with a gratifying burst of noise that disheveled a movement. Photographers poured off the truck, newsmen swarmed out of the press bus, and Eddie advanced on the 17th Street Bridge like a guerrilla leader at the head of a ragged, hungry troop deployment. Dr. Sergio Alvarez Enrique, the serene, plump, olive-skinned ambassador of Colombia and dean of the diplomatic corps, greeted Eddie at the doorway and steered him into the marble-floored foyer. Alvarez spoke a faultless, courtly English as though it were heritage from another country. Eddie had expected to be impressed, and he was not disappointed. He had met but few ambassadors in his life, and those more than a decade earlier during his lone term in Congress. Followed by his noisy army, Eddie was escorted past an exhibit of Bolivian paintings and into the large new council room where some 100 men and few women ambassadors, extraordinary and plenipotentiary, waited him. Dr. Alvarez introduced Eddie to the State Department's chief of protocol, a lean, jaded former polo player named H. Ambridge Hennicutt. Then Alvarez stationed Eddie near a floor-to-ceiling slab of marble which bore the seal of the Organization of American States. Not far away stood a long, linen-draped table bearing whiskey and champagne bottles and a silver bowl of lime-colored punch. The ambassadors formed a jagged line like patrons queuing up at a box office for tickets to a hit show. The drill, Eddie noted, consisted of Alvarez presenting each envoy to Hennicutt, and the protocol chief then handing the man or woman along to Eddie. Hennicutt pronounced each title and name as though doing a penance for having been afflicted with citizenship in a country so lacking civility as to nominate the likes of Eddie Quinn for its top executive officer. After 107 how-do-you-dos combined with limp to bone-crushing handshakes, Eddie saw Dr. Alvarez step to the council dais and rap smartly with the gavel, signaling for silence. Our guest, the Honorable Edward Nicholas Quinn, candidate for President of the United States of America, has graciously consented to favor us with a few words. Alvarez bowed his head. Commissioner Quinn? Eddie bowed in turn and faced the shuffling crowd of dark-suited diplomats. He noted a reaction he had seen before, a kind of amused, condescending curiosity, less unfriendly than distant. It reminded him again of the day he lunched at the posh Lynx Club in New York. I assume, said Eddie, after his opening amenities, that you will shortly cable your home offices and give some personal impressions of me, the new candidate, even though my chances of being elected aren't exactly great. Please tell them that, contrary to rumors, I can read and write and speak fair English, and that I don't wear a hard hat to diplomatic receptions. Still, I do consider myself a plain, ordinary American, and I want to make our voice heard before this campaign is over. We ordinary Americans want peace in the world. I guess that sounds trite to you seasoned diplomats who've heard it in many tongues. I don't have any magic formula to make people quit killing one another, but I do have some ideas about new approaches. Today I'd like to tell you about one of them. I can state it simply. If I'm elected president, I intend to propose a UN treaty binding all nations not to put any man into a military uniform of his country until he has passed his 50th birthday. Eddie paused. Most of his audience looked at him numbly, but he heard a few snickers from the envoys, and a buzz of the newsmen clustered near the doorway. If the big powers agree to such a treaty, I'm confident the smaller nations will fall in line, so that few men anywhere in the world need fear military service before the age of 50. Now Eddie saw many smiles, cynical but interested. Maybe we can abolish war. Maybe we can't abolish war, but I contend that older men can fight these modern wars just as well as the young. Men our age can press the missile button and man the naval rockets and drive the tanks. For centuries now, we've been killing off the best of the world's youth in our perpetual wars. Those who don't die come home maimed, blinded, faces, arms, and legs shot away, but the old men who send them off to fight sit home in comfortable offices, drink their booze, and move their pens around on maps. It wasn't always that way, as you know. In the old days, the knights and warlords, the kings and Viking chiefs led men of all ages into battle. If they decided to make war, at least the old leaders had the guts to fight themselves. But today, the slogan of the fat old man is, let our kids and your kids fight. There's something disgusting about those pictures of war conferences you see these days. You know the kind. Old generals and so-called statesmen, some of them in their 70s, many of them pot-bellied and bald, sit around big tables deciding where the youngsters should kill themselves off next. So let's resolve by treaty that men who dream up wars do the fighting. Nobody under 50 in a military uniform. Eddie's fanning glance caught the blanched face of Ambridge Hennicutt. The protocol chief was mopping his forehead with a handkerchief and looking as if he'd like to flee. Near him stood T.G., gazing up at Eddie in misty gratitude. Of course, since I'm 46 years old, you may think I'm trying to evade the new draft myself. Well, I won't quibble. If you want to make the lowest military service age 45, I'll go along. I just like 50 as a nice round number. So that, honored ambassadors, is my first peace message. Nobody under 50 marching off to war, and while I'm no psychologist, my guess is that if we force the older men to fight their own wars, there will be damn few of them. Wars, not old men. Thank you, and peace to all. Newsmen broke for the door, heading for telephones, but a baffled silence immobilized the diplomats. They regarded Eddie with an incredulous expression, as though they suspected they had been made the butt of some inside American joke. After a moment, Dr. Alvarez, forcing a wounded smile, clapped his hands, setting off a round of applause that made up in brevity what it lacked in vigor. The envoys stood uncertainly for a bit, then moved en masse to the bar, chattering away, like schoolboys who have been lectured by a lunatic. Dr. Alvarez, who had done his homework, fetched Eddie a ginger ale, touched glasses with his own scotch and soda, and said with an ineffable neutrality, "Very interesting, Mr. Commissioner." Eddie saw Ambridge Hennicutt march to the bar and throw down a straight shot of scotch. The Russian ambassador, a big, hearty man who looked like a playground director, bore down on Eddie with a tumbler of vodka. "I know you Irish." He nudged Eddie with his elbow. "I was on a special mission to Ireland last year." "You're lucky. I've never been to Ireland." Eddie joined Dr. Alvarez and the Russian in clinking glasses. Other diplomats moved in. "My cable this evening will be light of heart," the Russian zapped Eddie with an eyeball-to-eyeball dose of camaraderie. "I like that. A man becomes bored with the old themes of espionage and perfidy." "Peace is what we all want," said Eddie, "and I think it's time to try some new angles." And sometimes a jest stirs more response than a serious proposal. Is it not so, Mr. Quinn? A number of newsmen, notebooks open, had now joined the circle, and more diplomats fattened the fingers. "I hope you're not implying that my proposal was a joke, Mr. Ambassador. I mean every word of it." The Russian's laugh sounded a single report like the clang of a trash can, including those between the lines. "I congratulate you, Mr. Quinn. The world deserves a little fun from time to time." "I'm serious. I don't consider peace a laughing matter. Calling men over 50 old men is not a joke." The Russian beamed conspiratorially at his colleagues. "Very few of us have lived less than 50 years, but you call us old. I'm sure somewhere members of this corps would urge you to consult the gracious ladies of Washington." "Maybe I should have used the phrase middle-aged," said Eddie stubbornly. He was nettled now. "But we who plan the wars and order the battles are old compared to the young men we send off to die in them." The Russian squinted, assessing Eddie anew. His smile faded. "So we shall be serious, but my friend, if Russia is ever invaded again, all men, sons, fathers, grandfathers, and many women will take up arms to defend their country." Eddie thought of asking how many Russian grandfathers had marched into Hungary or Czechoslovakia along with the boyish tank crews, but he choked back the retort. "I'm talking about standing armies," he said. "If conscription everywhere were confined to those over 50, there would be little threat to the Soviet Union or any other country. You see, it is difficult to take your plan except as humor. Do you know what day this is?" Eddie shook his head. The ambassador said, "In the United States, obviously, it is a day for joking. My proposal is no joke, but I am trying to show how ridiculous this war in this age of missiles and H-bombs." The Russian nodded. "Let us drink to the interesting new idea." They raised their glasses once more. Eddie lingered for a half hour, chatting with envoys, straining to catch the score of bewildering accents. Many diplomats mirrored the reaction of the Soviet ambassador, but a few predicted that Quinn's remarks would touch off stimulating debates. Later, as he moved toward the exit, flanked by agents Flannery and Baker, Eddie spotted Vince Anderson among the newspapermen. "Come on, Vince, walk to the car with me." Anderson fell in step with the candidate. "How am I doing, Vince?" "I don't know how many votes you're making, Eddie, but you sure make page one every time you open your mouth." "Vince, Kate Witherspoon told me about her talk with you. You intend to write anything about that license tag?" "No, I gave her my word, but I wish I hadn't. She made a snotty crack." "That's not like her. Kate's okay, Vince. You probably startled her. She's a good dame. I appreciate your fairness. She did come up to Flannery's cabin, but it was a social visit, not politics. I understand. Forget it. Vince, give me a buzz about 4 tomorrow afternoon. I may have a little exclusive for Monday papers. That's not necessary. You're against repaying favors or too lazy to work on Sunday? Neither. I'll call you at 4. Outside, the coppery Continental gleamed in the fading autumn sunlight. Eddie caressed the fender and studied the body lines as he might those of a shapely woman. How about letting me drive back, Jim? Flannery looked unhappy. It's not a good idea, Eddie. Somebody hits you from the side, even a scratch, and the chief would eat my ass. Come on, Jim. There's no law against it. Only a few blocks, and we've got the escort. Eddie walked around the car and slid into the driver's seat. Flannery reluctantly climbed in beside him, and Eddie motioned T.G. to get into the rear seat where she sat alone, regal passenger. Eddie gunned the motor and the car purred away from the Pan American Union while photographers shoved and cursed as they fought for a good shot of the drive-it-yourself candidate. Behind the wheel, facing the stylish dashboard and sniffing the beloved odor of a new automobile, Eddie felt happy. He was not at all certain where his unorthodox campaign was headed, but it was good to realize that for once in his life he would go first class all the way.